You think you're doing everything right. You're giving attention, showing consistency, trying harder than ever, but somehow she's pulling away instead of coming closer. She's less excited, less responsive, less emotionally invested, and deep down, you feel it. Something has changed. What if the problem isn't what you're doing wrong, but what your behavior is revealing about you? Because attraction doesn't disappear randomly. It fades when certain patterns slowly kill the emotional tension she once felt. Over effort is often mistaken for dedication, and neediness is often disguised as care, but both carry an underlying message that quietly erodes attraction. Because when a man begins to overinvest emotionally before a solid connection is built, he is no longer expressing interest, he is signaling imbalance, and attraction cannot survive in imbalance. It requires tension, space, and a sense that both individuals are choosing each other freely rather than one trying to secure the other at any cost. And the moment your actions start coming from a place of fear rather than confidence, everything you do begins to feel heavier, more forced, and less genuine, even if your intentions are pure. Neediness is not about how much you like her. It is about how much you rely on her response to feel secure within yourself. And that reliance creates pressure because now every interaction carries an invisible expectation. Every message you send is loaded with anticipation. Every delay in her reply feels like a threat. And she senses that emotional weight even if you never express it directly, because human beings are deeply intuitive when it comes to energy. And what she begins to feel is not excitement, but obligation, not curiosity, but pressure. And no one craves what feels like a responsibility rather than a choice. The more you try to prove your worth through constant effort, the more you unintentionally communicate that your value is not already established, because high value individuals do not feel the need to convince others of their worth. They allow it to be discovered naturally. And when you over explain, over text, over give, and over adjust yourself just to maintain her attention, you remove the mystery that fuels attraction. You make everything about you easily accessible, predictable, and fully revealed. And without mystery, there is no desire to explore further, because the emotional experience becomes flat, repetitive, and lacking in excitement. There is also a psychological shift that happens when a woman realizes that you are more invested than she is. And this imbalance changes how she perceives you, not because she consciously decides to lose interest, but because attraction is deeply tied to perception. And when she sees that you are always available, always initiating, always trying to please, she begins to feel that she holds the power in the dynamic. And while control may sound desirable, it actually weakens attraction, because desire is strongest when there is uncertainty, when there is a sense that the other person is equally choosing but not fully owned, and over effort removes that uncertainty completely. Rejection, on the other hand, carries a completely different energy, because when a man faces rejection with composure and self respect, he maintains his sense of identity. He does not collapse emotionally, he does not chase for validation. And this creates a perception of strength, because walking away from something that does not choose you reflects self worth, and self worth is inherently attractive. Even if the interaction ends, the impression remains. And sometimes that impression holds more power than any amount of effort ever could, because it shows that your value is not dependent on her response. What makes over effort and neediness more damaging than rejection is that they slowly chip away at attraction instead of ending things clearly. They create a gradual decline where interest fades, excitement disappears, and emotional connection weakens over time. And you are left confused, trying harder, giving more, and unknowingly accelerating the very outcome you are trying to avoid. Because the more you invest from a place of insecurity, the less she feels the need to invest at all. And this imbalance continues to grow until there is nothing left to sustain the connection emotionally. When you operate from a place of grounded confidence, your actions are no longer driven by the fear of losing her, but by the genuine desire to share your time and energy without attachment to the outcome. And this is where attraction thrives because there is no pressure, no forced effort, no silent demand for validation, only a natural exchange where both individuals feel free to engage without emotional weight. And that freedom is what creates craving because people are drawn to what feels light, self assured, and emotionally stable, not to what feels dependent, overwhelming, and driven by the need to be reassured constantly. Emotional dependency does not announce itself loudly. It creeps in subtly through small shifts in behavior, through the need for constant reassurance, through the quiet expectation that her attention should stabilize your mood. And while it may feel natural to seek closeness, the problem begins when your emotional state becomes tied to her responses. Because the moment she senses that your happiness depends on her, your value in her eyes begins to change, not because she consciously decides it, but because attraction is deeply connected to perception of strength, and dependency signals the opposite of that. It reflects a lack of internal grounding, a lack of self sufficiency, and a quiet pressure that makes the connection feel heavier than it should be. When a man starts relying on a woman to feel secure, he unknowingly places her in a position of emotional authority, where her actions dictate his confidence, her presence defines his stability, and her absence creates anxiety. And this dynamic shifts the balance completely, because instead of two individuals choosing each other, it becomes one person needing and the other being needed. And while being desired can feel good initially, being needed in an emotional sense often creates discomfort because it removes the freedom that attraction requires to grow naturally. And what once felt like interest begins to feel like responsibility. And responsibility is not something people crave in the early stages of emotional connection. There is a silent loss of respect that happens when emotional dependency becomes visible, not in an obvious or harsh way, but in a gradual, almost unnoticeable decline in how she perceives your presence. Because respect is built on the perception that you are stable within yourself, that you can handle uncertainty without collapsing, that your identity remains intact regardless of external validation. And when that perception weakens, attraction follows because admiration cannot exist where there is emotional instability. And the more you look to her for reassurance, the less she sees you as someone who can stand on his own. Emotional dependency also removes the element of challenge. And without challenge, attraction begins to fade because desire is fueled by the sense that the other person is valuable, not easily secured, and not fully predictable. But when you become emotionally dependent, you make your position clear, you remove all ambiguity, and you place yourself in a state of constant availability where she no longer has to wonder about your interest or your presence. And while clarity may seem like a positive trait, too much of it too soon eliminates the tension that keeps someone emotionally engaged. And without that tension, the connection becomes flat, predictable, and less stimulating over time. Another layer of this dynamic is how emotional dependency affects your behavior. Because once your emotional state is tied to her, you begin to act differently. You overthink your words, you adjust your actions to avoid losing her, you prioritize her reactions over your authenticity. And in doing so, you slowly lose the qualities that made you attractive in the first place. Your confidence becomes inconsistent, your presence becomes reactive, and your decisions become influenced by fear rather than self assurance. And she senses this shift not through logic, but through the emotional tone of your interactions. And that tone begins to feel less grounded, less certain, and less appealing. What makes emotional dependency particularly damaging is that it often comes from a place of genuine interest, which is why many men fail to recognize it as a problem. They believe they are showing care, effort, and emotional availability. But there is a fine line between being open and being dependent. And that line is crossed when your sense of self becomes entangled with her validation, because true attraction is built on two complete individuals coming together, not one seeking completion through the other. And when that balance is lost, the connection no longer feels equal, it feels tilted, and that tilt slowly erodes the emotional intensity that once existed. When you develop emotional independence, everything about your presence changes, not in a forced or calculated way, but in a natural shift where your confidence is no longer tied to external responses, where your mood is not dictated by her behavior, and where your sense of self remains steady regardless of how the interaction unfolds. And this creates a completely different perception, because now you are not someone who needs to be validated. You are someone who exists with or without it. And that self sufficiency is what restores respect, rebuilds attraction, and reintroduces the emotional space necessary for her to feel drawn to you without pressure or obligation. Predictability feels safe, controlled, and logical. But attraction does not grow in what feels fully known. It grows in what feels partially undiscovered, because the human mind is naturally drawn to what it cannot completely figure out. And when your behavior becomes entirely predictable, when your responses can be anticipated, your availability guaranteed, and your reactions easily mapped, you remove the very element that keeps her emotionally engaged, which is curiosity. And without curiosity, there is no desire to explore deeper, no reason to wonder, no emotional pull that keeps her thinking about you when you are not present. Mystery is not about playing games or being intentionally confusing. It is about maintaining a sense of individuality and unpredictability in your emotional presence. It is about not revealing everything at once, not making your patterns so obvious that she feels she already understands you completely, because the moment someone feels they have fully figured you out, the excitement begins to fade, not because you have done something wrong, but because the process of discovery has ended. And attraction is deeply tied to that process, to the unfolding of layers, to the gradual understanding of who you are over time, rather than all at once. When a man becomes predictable, it often comes from a place of trying to create stability. He believes that consistency will build attraction, that being always available, always responsive, always aligned with her expectations, will make her feel secure and therefore more interested. But what actually happens is the opposite, because while consistency builds comfort, it does not build desire. And when there is too much comfort without variation, the emotional experience becomes flat. There is no contrast, no emotional spikes, no moments that stand out. And without those fluctuations, the connection loses its intensity and becomes something she no longer craves but simply accepts. There is also a psychological aspect to unpredictability that fuels attraction, because when your behavior is not entirely predictable, it creates a subtle tension, a sense that she cannot fully control or anticipate you, and that tension keeps her mentally engaged. It makes her think about your next move, your next response, your next interaction. And this mental engagement is what deepens emotional investment over time, because the more she thinks about you, the more space you occupy in her mind, and the more she begins to associate you with a feeling of excitement rather than routine. Predictability also signals a lack of independence, because when your actions revolve around a fixed pattern that always accommodates her, it reflects that your life is structured in a way that prioritizes her above everything else. And this removes the perception that you have your own world, your own rhythm, your own priorities that exist independently of her presence, and that independence is crucial for attraction because it creates the sense that you are choosing to engage rather than needing to. And that distinction is what keeps the dynamic balanced and intriguing rather than one-sided and predictable. Another layer to this is how predictability affects emotional anticipation, because desire is often built in the space between interactions, in the moments where she is not entirely sure when she will hear from you, how you will respond, or what the next interaction will feel like. And when those elements become fixed and expected, the anticipation disappears. And with it, the emotional buildup that makes each interaction feel exciting. And instead of looking forward to hearing from you, she begins to take it for granted because it follows a pattern that no longer surprises her or stimulates her curiosity. Mystery, when expressed naturally, creates a balance between presence and absence, between clarity and ambiguity, where she knows enough to feel connected, but not so much that she feels there is nothing left to discover. And this balance keeps the emotional experience alive because it allows her to continuously learn, question, and explore who you are. And that ongoing process is what sustains desire over time, because attraction is not a static feeling. It is something that needs variation, depth, and a sense of progression to remain strong. When you shift away from predictability, not by forcing inconsistency, but by focusing on your own life, your own priorities, and your own emotional rhythm, your interactions naturally become less controlled and more dynamic. And this creates a sense of authenticity that cannot be replicated through calculated behavior, because now you are not acting in a way that is designed to maintain her interest. You are simply living in a way that reflects your independence, and that independence introduces the very uncertainty that fuels curiosity, rebuilds emotional tension, and makes her experience of you feel less like a routine and more like something she cannot fully predict or easily replace. When a man loses focus on himself, it does not happen in one dramatic moment. It happens gradually through small decisions where he begins to prioritize her attention over his own growth, her presence over his purpose, and her validation over his internal stability. And while this shift may feel natural when you are emotionally invested, it slowly changes how you are perceived, because attraction is not sustained by how much attention you give. It is sustained by who you are when you are not giving that attention. And when your identity becomes centered around her, you stop being someone she is drawn to and start becoming someone who revolves around her. Self-focus is not about selfishness. It is about maintaining a strong sense of direction, discipline, and purpose that exists independently of any relationship. And when that focus weakens, everything else begins to lose structure. Your ambition becomes inconsistent, your priorities become unclear, and your time starts being shaped around her availability rather than your own goals. And this shift does not go unnoticed, because what originally attracted her was not just your interest in her, but the life you were building, the mindset you carried, and the sense that you were moving forward regardless of who was in your life. When you stop focusing on yourself, you unintentionally communicate that your world is small enough to revolve around one person. And that perception reduces your value because attraction is deeply connected to expansion, to the idea that you are growing, evolving, and progressing. And when that progression slows down or stops, the emotional appeal begins to fade. Not because she consciously decides it, but because there is nothing new to experience, nothing dynamic to be drawn towards, and the connection starts to feel stagnant rather than inspiring. There is also a subtle loss of respect that comes with a lack of self focus because respect is built on the perception that you have standards, boundaries, and a life that requires your attention. And when you consistently place her above everything else, you signal that those elements are either weak or non existent. And while it may seem like you are showing commitment, what you are actually showing is a willingness to neglect your own priorities, and that creates an imbalance where she is elevated while you slowly lower yourself. And attraction cannot survive in a dynamic where one person is placed above the other in such a way. Another consequence of losing self focus is that your emotional stability becomes compromised because when your life lacks structure and purpose, you begin to rely more heavily on the relationship for fulfillment. And this creates a form of dependency where her presence becomes your primary source of satisfaction. And as that dependency grows, your behavior begins to change. You become more reactive, more sensitive to her actions, more affected by her moods, and less grounded in your own state. And this shift in energy makes you appear less stable, less certain, and ultimately less attractive. What makes self focus so powerful is that it naturally creates space. And space is essential for attraction because it allows both individuals to maintain their individuality while still choosing to connect. But when that space disappears, when your time, attention, and energy are constantly directed toward her, the relationship loses its sense of balance. And instead of two independent individuals coming together, it becomes one person merging into the other. And that fusion removes the tension, the curiosity, and the emotional distance that keeps desire alive. Over time, the lack of self focus leads to a predictable pattern where you give more, expect more, and feel more affected when those expectations are not met. And this creates a cycle where you try to compensate by investing even further, thinking that more effort will restore what has been lost. But the reality is that attraction is not restored through increased attention. It is restored through regained identity, through returning to the habits, goals, and mindset that made you compelling in the first place. Because when you are focused on your own growth, your energy changes, your presence becomes more grounded, and your interactions feel less like a pursuit and more like a choice. When you rebuild self focus, you are not distancing yourself in a manipulative way. You are simply realigning with who you are outside of the relationship. And that realignment shifts everything because now your attention is not given out of need, but out of intention. Your time is not always available, but it is valuable. And your presence is no longer constant, but meaningful. And it is this shift that gradually restores the sense of intrigue, respect, and attraction that fades when a man forgets himself in the process of trying to keep someone else. One of the most common misunderstandings men fall into is believing that attraction can be built and maintained through logic, through doing the right things, saying the correct words, and following a structured formula that should lead to a predictable emotional outcome. But human connection, especially attraction, does not operate on logic. It operates on emotional experience. And no matter how much effort you put into being technically right, if the emotional experience you create is flat, predictable, or uninspiring, the connection will slowly lose its intensity because people are not moved by what makes sense. They are moved by what they feel in your presence. Logical effort often looks like consistency, availability, problem solving, and trying to meet every perceived expectation. And while these traits may seem valuable on the surface, they do not automatically translate into desire, because desire is not a reward for effort. It is a response to emotional stimulation. And when your actions are driven by a need to prove your worth rather than a natural expression of who you are, they begin to feel calculated, controlled, and lacking in spontaneity. And that lack of spontaneity removes the emotional variation that keeps someone engaged, because attraction needs moments that break patterns, moments that create a shift in feeling, not just a repetition of what is expected. When you rely on logic, you focus on what should work rather than what actually creates impact. You think that replying quickly shows interest, that always being there shows reliability, that avoiding mistakes keeps the connection stable. But what you overlook is that stability without emotional depth becomes routine. And routine does not create excitement, it creates familiarity. And while familiarity can maintain a connection, it cannot intensify it. And over time, the absence of emotional highs and lows makes the interaction feel less memorable, less engaging, and ultimately less desirable. Emotional experience, on the other hand, is built through how you make her feel in the moment, through the energy you bring into the interaction, through the subtle shifts in tone, presence, and unpredictability that create a sense of aliveness. And this cannot be manufactured through a checklist because it comes from being grounded in yourself rather than focused on achieving a specific outcome. And when you are grounded, your responses are not calculated, they are natural. They carry authenticity. And that authenticity is what creates emotional impact because it feels real rather than rehearsed. Another important aspect is that emotions are not linear. They do not follow a straight path where more effort equals more attraction. In fact, too much effort in a logical sense often reduces emotional intensity because it removes uncertainty. It answers every question before it can even be asked, and it fills every gap that would otherwise create anticipation. And anticipation is a key component of desire because it builds emotional momentum. It allows feelings to develop in the space between interactions rather than being constantly saturated with attention. When a woman responds to an emotional experience, she is responding to how she feels during and after interacting with you, not to how much you have invested or how perfectly you have behaved. And those feelings are shaped by contrast, by moments of presence followed by space, by interactions that feel engaging rather than routine. And when that emotional rhythm is missing, no amount of logical effort can compensate for it because you cannot rationalize someone into feeling something they do not naturally experience. The problem with relying on logic is that it often disconnects you from your own emotional expression. You become more focused on doing things correctly than on being present, more concerned with avoiding mistakes than with creating moments. And this creates a controlled version of yourself that lacks depth because real connection is not built on perfection. It is built on emotional authenticity, on the ability to express, to engage, and to create a dynamic experience that feels alive rather than structured. When you shift away from logic as your primary approach and begin to focus on the emotional quality of your interactions, everything changes because now you are not trying to earn attraction through effort. You are allowing it to develop through experience, through the way you carry yourself, the way you respond, and the way you create an atmosphere that feels different from the predictable patterns she encounters elsewhere. And that difference is what captures attention, sustains interest, and builds a connection that is felt rather than calculated. Most men become fixated on actions, on what to say, how often to text, when to call, how to behave in specific situations, believing that attraction is the result of doing the right things in the right order. But what they fail to understand is that actions are only the surface, and beneath every action is an energy that communicates far more than the action itself, because two people can do the exact same thing, say the same words, follow the same pattern, yet create completely different emotional reactions. And the difference lies in the energy behind it, the intention, the emotional state, and the level of internal confidence or insecurity that is being carried into the interaction. Energy is what she feels before she even processes what you are doing. It is the tone behind your voice, the presence behind your words, the subtle emotional signal that reveals whether you are grounded or seeking validation. confident or uncertain, self contained or dependent. And this is why focusing purely on actions often leads to confusion, because you may believe you are doing everything correctly, yet the results do not match your expectations. And that disconnect happens because your energy is not aligned with the outcome you are trying to create. You are acting confident but feeling insecure, acting detached but internally attached, acting calm but emotionally reactive, and that internal contradiction is always felt, even if it is never directly acknowledged.